Channel, for those who like a happy ending, here's a true story of how two fighters became the best of friends. It's Lewis versus Schmeling.
Max Schmeling was a German icon who became the world heavyweight boxing champion only 6 years after his first professional fight. Joe Louis was the first black superstar whom even Muhammad Ali called the greatest of all time. Louis and Schmeling were to meet twice in the ring, with one victory each. They were cast as bitter enemies, the heroic black man fighting for freedom and the supremacist white Nazi. But Louis was never free, and Schmeling was never a Nazi.
I know he was not a Nazi. I know he never belonged to the party. He could have profited very much by belonging to the party.
I don't think Max Schmeling and Joe Louis were ever enemies. I think they were strong competitors. I think they were, at the end of their lives, very close friends.
Although they came from very different backgrounds, there are some interesting parallels between these two boxers who fought so famously and so violently in the ring. In the late 1920s, Berlin was perhaps the most glittering and decadent city in the world. A center for arts and science, and a mecca for writers, artists, sports stars, and playboys and playgirls. By the age of 24, Schmeling was Europe's best-known boxer, a German superstar with movie idol looks and equally celebrated fans. Marlene Dietrich was one of many glamorous admirers.
Max Schmeling was an icon already back in the 1920s. I mean, when he was young, when he first started, as he began to become popular as a boxer, he went beyond the boxing image and became an important kind of darling of the left intelligentsia and the avant-garde and artists and everything else. So he's somebody who has always carried a kind of aura about him, and has stood for something more than just boxing, or all the things boxing can be.
The roots to his fame, however, stemmed from his prowess in the ring and from his sportsmanship. Max Schmeling, born in 1905, grew up in a farming community in eastern Germany, about 70 miles from Berlin. During the First World War, his father was a seaman and his mother worked for the postal service. At school, the young Max excelled at every sport, but at little else. In 1919, he got his first job as a messenger boy, delivering advertisements to Hamburg newspaper offices. His bosses had the foresight to encourage his sport, mainly football. Boxing had been banned in Germany until 1918, and it wasn't until 1921 that Max saw his first boxing match on film at the local cinema. He was hooked. At age 16, he bought a pair of second-hand boxing gloves and never looked back. Max Schmeling was nearly 9 years old when Joe Louis Barrow, as he was christened, was born near Lafayette in Alabama. Louis was the son of poor sharecroppers. The family moved to Detroit before Joe was a teenager. At 15, Louis took to the fight game as a way of getting out of the ghetto. He quickly showed the skills that would soon make him perhaps the best boxer the world has ever seen, and certainly one of the most popular. Both Joe Louis and Max Schmeling became much-loved national figures, well beyond the boxing fraternity. In his first year as a professional, Louis fought 23 opponents and knocked out all but 4 of them. He wasn't tagged the Brown Bomber for nothing. On the other side of the Atlantic, Max Schmeling, too, had a rapid rise to the top. Only 3 years after taking up boxing, he fought his first professional fight. 6 years later, in 1930, he became the heavyweight champion of the world when he beat the American Jack Sharkey, but it was a controversial decision.
And here's the action the crowd was yelling for. Schmeling comes in close and swings a wild left hook around Sharkey's neck. That's Sharkey with his back to us there, and that's Sharkey uncorking a left hook, one of the most disputed blows in ring history. Schmeling, claiming a foul, goes down. Officials decide the blow was low, and Max Schmeling is the first European to be heavyweight champion of the world.
Schmeling was at the height of his fame, but he never let it go to his head. That year, as usual, he was to be seen giving his time to help those less fortunate than himself, particularly children. He always regretted not having children of his own. Two years later, in 1932, Schmeling was back in the United States in defense of his world title.
In 1932, Schmeling was trained in New York to defend his title against Jack Sharkey. And I remember it was a Sunday, and the governor of New York came down, Franklin D. Roosevelt. And, of course, Roosevelt spoke German. He spoke a very good German. And Roosevelt came to Schmeling's camp and said, "I am cheering for you." Well, he was running for office. Sharkey was Lithuanian descent, and there were more German Americans voting than there were Lithuanian Americans voting.
Notwithstanding Roosevelt's support, Schmeling lost his title to Sharkey in 1932. But the glamorous Max had lost none of his appeal to his fans, and he was very much an international celebrity when he married the beautiful Czech film star Annie Andre in 1933. Louis married his first wife, Marva, just over 2 years later in 1935 after a lightning courtship. But he didn't let that get in the way of his boxing. He stepped into the ring on the same day to fight Max Baer. Baer was a tough opponent with a string of victories to his credit, but the Brown Bomber won with a knockout. He was just 21 but already showing signs of greatness. Max Schmeling, past 30 and probably past his prime, now had to beat Joe Louis if he ever wanted another shot at the world title. So Schmeling got back to serious training, and a year later in 1936, he was scheduled to fight Louis. As he sailed to America for the bout, Schmeling told reporters that he'd spotted a flaw in Louis's fighting.
Have you detected any particular weakness in the Brown Bomber?
Yes, I did, but I won't tell.
What Schmeling had seen was Louis in action. He had in fact traveled to New York 6 months before, specifically to study Louis's technique against Paulino Uzqueda of Spain. As a celebrity, Schmeling was invited into the ring to meet the contestants, but he was only interested in watching one of them, Joe Louis.
Schmeling was right here, and he was watching Louis drop his left. And you'll see, he does it consistently. See, there he drops it right there. See how he has dropped his left? And he's dropped his left. If Paulino were closer, he could hit Louis with the right. See, his jaw is exposed. Now, what Louis should have done, when he shot his left, he should have shot it like that, with his right hand protecting his jaw here, and then come over like this, see? But instead, Louis did like this and set himself and came out. And of course, as he went like this, his jaw was exposed. That happened all the time. He was always doing that. But no one else was able to take advantage of it because Louis was so fast.
Schmeling spent the next 6 months in training and minutely studying Louis's form.
Schmeling took not only this film back, but he took other film. He had suitcases for it, and he kept time and time.
Louis, meanwhile, wasn't taking the forthcoming bout with Schmeling too seriously. He fitted his training in around golf. Louis was passionate about the game, a trait inherited by his son, Joe Louis Barrow, Jr.
In 1936, there's no question that my father was more concerned about the golf course in training for Max Schmeling. His trainer, Jack Blackburn, said that the muscles that he was using for golf were the wrong muscles for boxing. And he just didn't mentally prepare for it, because I'm quite certain that he felt that Max was 8 years older, not as strong, didn't have the endurance, and the fact of the matter is Max had the greater will. And as a result, in boxing, if you have the greater will, you can win.
In 1936, no one could doubt Schmeling's will to win.
After 4 weeks hard training, I am in very good condition. And all I have to do now is just to keep it as it is.
As it is was the prescription for Lewis as well. He had a continuous string of knockouts to his credit for his last 10 fights. Lewis was now a source of inspiration to millions of black Americans. They followed his every bout with increasing admiration and joy.
He recognized his particular contribution to black America, because this was the only place that someone could clearly fight a white man and get away with it in America in those days.
The date for that first bout had been set for June the 19th, 1936. Lewis had never lost a professional bout and was very much the favorite for his first fight against Schmeling.
Oh, 10-1 for Joe Lewis. At one time it was 18-1. Even people like Gene Tunney and Jack Dempsey didn't give Schmeling a chance. He was came as a sacrificial lamb.
New York's Yankee Stadium, June 1936. Joe Lewis and Max Schmeling meet for the first time in the ring. It wasn't a title fight, but for Schmeling, it was every bit as important if he was ever to have another crack at the championship. As always when fighting in the US, Schmeling was accompanied by his Jewish-American manager, Joe Jacobs. Hitler had tried to persuade Schmeling to dump Jacobs, but Schmeling had always refused. The first 3 rounds were pretty even, but after a slow start to round 4, Schmeling did something no one else had ever done. He put the brown bomber on the floor. But Lewis wasn't finished and clung on tenaciously until the 12th round, resisting everything that Schmeling could throw at him.
Schmeling got over 2 more hard rights to Lewis's jaw and made Lewis give ground, and there Schmeling straightened up Lewis with hard rights and left to the jaw. He has puffed up Lewis's left cheek, and Lewis is down. Lewis is down, hanging to the roof.
It was the first and only time Lewis was knocked out while he was world champion.
Blinking his eyes, shaking his head. The count is done. The fight is over. The fight is over.
Typically, Schmeling was the first person to help his opponent to his feet before savoring his unlikely victory.
What were your reactions in the first 3 rounds of that fight?
After the second round, I was very sure I had in my hand.
Well, that's fine. Did you at any time feel that Lewis was a very dangerous fighter?
Oh yes, he was dangerous during the whole fight.
Which of the punches that he landed did you consider the most dangerous?
Well, he's a very good left-hander, and he used a very powerful right.
Max, what was the punch with which you knocked out Joe Lewis?
You want me to show you?
Yes, try it. Oh boy, that's great.
Many white Americans who were rooting for the German boxer agreed that the punch was great. But nearly every black man saw Lewis's defeat as a personal tragedy. There were even riots in Harlem as frustration boiled over. Meanwhile, Schmeling was given a special berth on the then fastest way across the Atlantic in a German Zeppelin, the Hindenburg. His wife Annie Andre was at the aerodrome in Frankfurt to meet him along with hundreds of well-wishers. With a hero's welcome, he was rushed to the Reichschancellery in the center of Berlin to meet Hitler and other members of the Nazi High Command. Although now branded as Hitler's boxer, Schmeling was never a Nazi sympathizer. Indeed, he was to use his popularity and his favored position with Hitler to help a number of Jews in Germany. He would even risk his life. Berlin had been the fun capital of the world, but times were changing in Germany. Hitler's stranglehold was tightening. The Jewish friends who Schmeling used to meet at the Roxy Bar and elsewhere in Berlin began to leave or to disappear. The sculptor Franz Torak, who made a bronze of Schmeling, had a Jewish wife who was threatened with deportation. Torak asked Schmeling to intervene, and the boxer went straight to Goebbels. Although Goebbels was incensed, Torak's wife was spared.
What separated Schmeling from a lot of stars in a similar position was that he was willing to take risks and test the limits of what he could do. And in a number of instances, he made arguments for protecting Jews and other people who were, for political or other reasons, in trouble. He went directly to the authorities and to the highest authorities in order to argue and to help them. He had a direct line to Hitler through Hitler's private photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann. And so he could call Hoffmann directly and say, I've got to speak to Hitler.
Ironically, Schmeling used his direct line to Hitler to avoid receiving the Dagger of Honor from the Sturmabteilung, or stormtroopers. He was able to convince Hitler that he did most of his fighting in the United States, and a stormtrooper's Dagger of Honor would not endear him to the Americans.
Well, with the SA was basically the stormtroopers who were with Hitler from the beginning of the founding of the Nazi Party in Germany. And even though they then, once he was in power, they became less important than the SS, to receive an award from the SA was a national honor, and to refuse to receive that award would be an act of bravery.
2 months after beating Joe Louis, Schmeling signed to fight with another American, James J. Braddock, for the World Heavyweight Championship. But Schmeling was robbed. Braddock feigned injury and illness, and the match was cancelled. Then in June 1937, Braddock lost his title to Joe Louis. If Schmeling wanted the championship back, he would have to beat Louis again. The German boxer, meanwhile, continued to meet his Jewish friends whenever he traveled abroad. He made no secret of it, sometimes even posing for photographs.
One of these pictures ended up in the newspapers, and it also ended up on the desk of Joseph Goebbels. And he was horrified that here Schmeling was abroad, obviously cavorting with Jews, and that was not acceptable in his mind. And Goebbels turned to him and he said, Herr Schmeling, you come to us because you want all us to help you in these ways, and then you refuse to play the game. You continue to cavort with these Jews, something along those lines. So that was a warning directly and unsolicited from Goebbels that Schmeling was being watched and he had crossed the line, and Goebbels wanted to tell him that he crossed the line.
In March 1938, German troops marched into Austria for what the Germans called the reunification of the two countries, the Anschluss.
Ladies and gentlemen, at the Austrian frontier town of Linz, an endless stream of German soldiers is pouring into Austria. The cheers are for Chancellor Adolf Hitler, returning to his homeland for the first time in almost 25 years. Now, for the first time in history, Austria and Germany are one nation with one leader.
It was April 1938. The fear of war in Europe was very real when Max Schmeling arrived in New York aboard the German liner the Bremen for his second bout against the world heavyweight champion, Joe Louis. Lewis had already successfully defended his world title 3 times, but this fight was billed as the Nazis versus freedom, with Joe Louis carrying nothing less than the fate of the world on his shoulders.
In fact, the Nazi press was appalled at the extent to which the American press were turning Schmeling into a Nazi. It was creating anti-German feeling unnecessarily. And this was not, I mean, to put it into a context, this is not what Hitler wanted.
Even the White House got involved. Franklin D. Roosevelt had maintained a regular correspondence with Max Schmeling in the early 30s and even supported him against the Lithuanian-American Jack Sharkey in 1932. But by 1938, all that had changed.
In 1938, Roosevelt asked Lewis to come to the White House, and I'd like to slap his muscles around and said, "We need muscles like this to defeat Nazi Germany." This was in 38. 3.5 years before we entered the war. But the atmosphere was very much of that.
Max Schmeling was a very terrific boxer. He was not a Nazi. Certainly he was a German, and in those days any German was considered a Nazi. I think Adolf Hitler used Max Schmeling in terms of the political propaganda just as Franklin Roosevelt used my father. These were 2 strong, powerful men representing 2 strong, powerful countries, and obviously the outcome was significant for both countries.
Joe Louis set up his 38 training camp at Ponton Lakes in New Jersey, determined this time to train hard for the rematch. Ponton Lakes was a favorite training camp for many boxers. Louis regarded it as his lucky place, and he's remembered here with particular affection.
I lived right on Lakeside Avenue where my grandfather had his small farm. And Joe and the sparring partners used to run around the lake, and they'd end up in my grandfather's apple orchard eating apples. I'd run with them down to the lake. I couldn't go any further. My mother made me come back. And then Joe used to take us all to the movies on Saturday. He'd line everybody up on the main street, all the kids, and he'd pay for everybody, then he'd come in and sit with us in the movie.
Louis is commemorated here not just because he was an all-American hero. He did much for the community, both when he was training and after he'd retired. But Louis couldn't buy a home here. He'd wanted to, but in the 1930s, no one would sell to a black man, not even the world heavyweight champion.
Of course, that was the irony. I mean, my father was representing freedom and democracy of the United States, but he couldn't live those freedoms. He couldn't eat where he wanted to eat. He couldn't be educated where he wanted to educate, couldn't live where he wanted to live. The United States in the 30s and 40s and 50s was a very segregated society. So while he represented that and certainly transcended to be an American hero, he couldn't experience all the freedoms of all Americans.
But in June 1938, Louis fixed his attention on boxing rather than politics and on the bout set for the Yankee Stadium in New York City. If he didn't win this world title fight against Max Schmeling, he was ruined. The stakes were no less for Schmeling. There were reports that if he lost, he might be killed when he returned to Germany. The gate was the biggest ever for a boxing match, over $1 million in ticket sales, equivalent to over 10 million in today's dollars. Louis at 23 was younger and taller and very much the favorite. Schmeling was 32 and although previously a popular boxer in America, was characterized this time in the press as fighting for Hitler. Louis was seen as fighting for the honor and freedom of the world.
When Schmeling was walking down to the fight, they were throwing apples, bananas, rocks, everything at him. The whole atmosphere was that Schmeling represented Nazi Germany.
In a 1967 interview, Max Schmeling recalled how he felt.
1938, you know how it was in Germany, it was a dictatorship. And I was very liked in America. I had many, many friends. But after all, I was a German. And when I went from the dressing cabin, I went in the ring, I was called many names and bad names, and I was thrown with papers and cups and cigarette cases and all these things. You know, I was a little disgusted about this all, And then the fight started.
The atmosphere in the stadium was electric. Both men spent the first minute testing out the other, and then suddenly Schmeling was in trouble.
Light brown gloves on, in close, and Lewis brings a very hard punch over to Schmeling's face, drives him against the ropes, and he's piling into Schmeling there. Schmeling has his back to him, and Lewis is pounding him against the ropes. Schmeling looks groggy. Schmeling looks groggy, and he's just hanging on to the ropes there. But now he's broken away. Schmeling is down. Schmeling is down from a hard, short right to the jaw, but he's up again. Lewis crashed a hard right, and Schmeling is down again. And he's getting up immediately. Schmeling has gone down twice now from hard right to the head there, and Schmeling is down again. And he's going to take a count this time. Schmeling is down. He's trying to get up. He's trying to get up. He's down there. It looks like a first-round knockout. He slips it over to his corner, holding up Lewis's hand. Lewis is the winner. The crowd has just gone crazy here.
It was all over in 124 seconds, with Schmeling left badly injured. The home crowd was ecstatic. Schmeling himself had no excuses.
I was laying on the ring ropes, and Joe just tried to hit my heart, and I turned in his head, and he hit me in the kidneys. You know, it wasn't his fault. It was my fault just the same.
The German radio audience, however, never heard the explanation, nor even the end of the fight. As it became obvious that Schmeling was in deep trouble, someone pulled the live radio feed to Germany, so the listeners never heard the result. But the German propaganda machine hadn't entirely abandoned Schmeling. Not yet. Despite Schmeling's own version of the final moments of the fight, some of the first newspaper stories hinted that he thought he'd been fouled by Lewis.
The next day, the German ambassador shows up in the hospital and tries to get Schmeling to actually come out and say that he had been fouled. And Schmeling immediately distanced himself from that and said, no, that was not a foul. I was fairly whipped.
It was the end for Schmeling. After 2 weeks in the hospital, he went home by ship without fanfare and arrived without welcome. For the Nazis, the thrashed boxer had no place in their pantheon of heroes. With his reputation and influence within the Nazi Party at its lowest, Schmeling was about to take the greatest risk of his life. It was late 1938 and life was sweet for Joe Louis. He had beaten Max Schmeling and had avenged the earlier defeat, Lewis's only defeat in a career which had already notched up nearly 40 victories. In Germany, things were very different for Max Schmeling. From the early 30s on, the Nazis increasingly blamed Jews for Germany's economic difficulties and constantly promoted antagonism towards Jews. In November 1938, this orchestrated unrest reached its zenith with a night of rioting and looting of Jewish property that has become known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. One man in particular has reason to remember Max Schmeling with gratitude.
On Kristallnight, November the 9th, 1938, my father asked Max Schmeling to take me into his house, and he took us for 3 days.
Henry Lewin is now a rich and successful businessman in America, running hotels and gaming establishments in Las Vegas and elsewhere. But in 1938, he and his younger brother Werner were Jewish refugees in Berlin.
Max Schmeling helped my father and myself at a time where he had no benefit. My father was not a rich man anymore. Everything was taken away from him. There was nothing this man could gain. He brought us back to our family in his car. And this car was 3 cars like this in Berlin. So everybody knew this was Max Schmeling. If this wouldn't have happened that night, I wouldn't be here tonight.
16 months after Max Schmeling lost his second fight with Joe Louis, Germany was at war. Now decidedly out of favor with the Nazis, Schmeling was sent off for paratrooper training, even though he was well over the draft age.
That was clearly a punishment. There was no other figure like him, a star in the cinema world or a major athlete or anyone else, who was sent off to war. He was 33 years old, and obviously way beyond the age where it would be fighting necessary. He clearly was being punished.
That husky young Negro en route to an Army induction center is the heavyweight boxing champion of the world, Joe Louis, the boy who beat Max Schmeling.
Louis also went to war, volunteering for the Army when America mobilized in 1941. The US government quickly used Louis's popularity to appeal to other young black men to join up.
The Army can use that fighting spirit, and Joe Louis is now a corporal of cavalry, somewhere in the West.
There was a treatment of black soldiers in the Second World War, even in that war, which was obviously as second-grade citizens. And so on the one hand, using Louis as a way of drawing in young black men to fight for the country, and then putting them in a situation in which, in some cases, they were clearly separated and segregated, is I think, a cynical act. But they were going to use anybody they could in the struggle against fascism.
I think Joe Louis was significant in terms of the eventual racial changes that occurred in the United States. First of all, during the war, every time he saw prejudices and segregation in the United States Army, he would call Washington and say, it's not right for black troops here. And the generals and the Secretary of Army would pick up the phone and call that base and that station and say, get it right. I think that people would say that because there was a Joe Louis, there's a Jackie Robinson in baseball. On several occasions, civil rights leaders have told me that they got the strength to do more than was expected or more than was allowed of them because of the strength that they received because of the achievements and successes of Joe Louis.
Louis was the centerpiece of one of the major black recruitment films of the war produced by the US government.
In 1 minute and 49 seconds, an American fist won a victory. But it wasn't the final victory. No, that victory is going to take a little longer, and a whole lot more American fists. Now those two men that were matched in the ring that night are matched again. This time it's a fight not between man and man, but between nation and nation. It's a fight for the real championship of the world, to determine which way of life shall survive.
In 1941, with German troops advancing on all fronts, Schmeling was sent to Greece with his paratrooper regiment. But in his first jump into Crete, he aggravated the back injury he'd sustained in his second fight with Louis. Schmeling was unfit to fight for the rest of the war. Louis also didn't do much fighting, but for very different reasons. He spent his time on morale-boosting duty. Many believe his 1938 victory over Schmeling helped towards a positive outcome in the war.
Many people feel that Joe Louis's victory in 1938 was a preamble to World War II. There was one Polish Jew who said that he survived the concentration camps because he knew the Germans wouldn't win because Joe Louis had defeated Max Schmeling.
Louis traveled widely throughout the war, giving exhibition boxing matches and generally pressing the flesh. He also donated to the American war effort the purses from the 2 professional matches he fought after the United States joined the war. They totaled over $1 million in today's money. But Louis's generosity would end up ruining him. The Internal Revenue Service charged Louis income tax on the donation and interest when he failed to pay.
It was particularly unfortunate because for all the things that my father did for this country, for the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, not to recognize the contributions he made, he donated one entire purse to the Navy Relief Fund and another to the Army Relief Fund. Because the checks were made out to him, and he immediately signed them over back to the Navy Relief Funds, the IRS said that's still income to him. And that's when the trouble began. And there's no question they could have relieved him of that, which I think was a very, very poor treatment of my father.
The greatest rivals in boxing history would meet again, but not in the ring. When the war was over, Germany was in ruins, but Max Schmeling didn't suffer the same fate as the American heavyweight champion Joe Louis. Schmeling tried his hand at a number of ventures, and as Germany prospered after the war, Schmeling prospered too. A former boxing contact, American Jim Farley, was now the president of Coca-Cola International. And in 1953, he invited Schmeling to invest in a franchise in Hamburg. Schmeling has been associated with the company ever since, but he had not forgotten his old adversary from before the war.
In 1950, when Max Schmeling came to the United States to referee a fight, he went to my father's house and said, "Where's the champ?" And they said, "Well, he's on the golf course." And so they called the golf course and said, "Max Schmeling's here to see you." And my father walked off the golf course and to visit with Max Schmeling. Now, the significance of that is that my father was on the golf course when I was born, and he was on the golf course when my sister was born. But yet he came off the golf course when Max Schmeling was there.
Years later, Joe was to give a few golf pointers to Max, but that day marked the rekindling of a very special relationship.
I just want to clear the situation. You know, I wanted to tell him that from my side never was anything, any hate or something like that. It was just all publicity stuff, and I'm sorry if he believed it. He took my arms and he was both crying, you know. He was crying, I was crying. And I said, "Listen, Joe, you didn't believe this, I hope." He said, "No, Max, and even if I did it, you know, it's all forgotten now, and we are good friends. And since, you know, we are very, very good friends, you know."
Over the next few years, the two met whenever they could, and the friendship that had been born in the ring out of mutual respect for the other's skills developed into a deep and lasting bond. And Max was able to help Joe financially as well.
From time to time, Max sent funds to assist my father in some of his medical care. Max was very helpful to my father's third wife, Martha. The fact that he was always there and always cared, living, 5,000-6,000 miles away, because he really deeply cared for my father.
Schmeling could afford to help Joe and his family. With boxing well behind him, Schmeling could concentrate on his other interests, and he built up his business into one of the major Coca-Cola franchises in Germany. Joe Louis's life, on the other hand, was going in a quite different direction. In 1950, to stave off debts, he came out of retirement and went back into boxing. For a year he did well, but it was no career for an aging hero.
Marciano pitching with everything he's got. Backed his man to the ropes to finish him off. Now watch.
It came to an end with a humiliating defeat by Rocky Marciano. Marciano never forgave himself for the knockout punch, though Louis never held it against him.
This is the second time in his career he was knocked out, and the first since Max Schmeling did it in 1936.
But worse was to come for Louis.
Climbing into the ring again, Joe Louis. The former heavyweight boxing champion, who'll be 42 soon, is trying the wrestling game.
When he couldn't box anymore, Louis tried his hand at professional wrestling.
For his grappling debut in Washington, the Bomber takes on cowboy Rocky Lee, 320 pounds. After 10 minutes of tugging, hauling, and poking, a right forearm smash sends Lee out of the ring. And the winner is Joe Louis, a solid right.
Even though he won his bouts, it was a sad end to a brilliant career in the ring. He was still laden with debt, even though his third wife Martha, to whom he'd been married since 1959, had helped straighten out his finances. In 1971, they moved to Las Vegas, where Joe was a celebrity doorman. By now, Louis was in increasingly poor health and addicted to cocaine. He had to rely on the charity of his friends, including Max Schmeling. And finally, in 1981, just a month before his 67th birthday, Joe died of a heart attack. He still owed the government well over $1 million. But that didn't matter to his friends. They gave him a massive send-off from Las Vegas. The coffin lay open at Caesar's Palace, and 3,000 people came to the funeral. Max Schmeling couldn't get to America, but there was one last thing he wanted to do for his friend Joe Louis. He called Henry Lewin, one of the young Jewish boys he'd rescued from Berlin just before the war.
I was at the Las Vegas Hilton. Max Schmeling is on the phone from Hamburg. He says, Henry, Joe Louis died. His coffin is displayed in the ballroom at Caesar's Palace. And I would be very appreciative if you accept that I cable you a large amount of money, that you put in an envelope, and all you have to do is go over there and give the widow of Joe Louis, Mrs. Louis, this envelope and say it's von Max Schmeling. I went over there. I was sitting next to Mrs. Louis on the chair, and I talked slowly, saying, Mrs. Louis, here's an envelope from Max Schmeling. Oh, she says, Henry, Max Schmeling, our true friend.
2 days later, Joe Louis was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, finally laid to rest in a plot just below the tomb of the unknown soldier.
It is wise providence to take out of this world the soul of our deceased Joe Louis Barrow. Hey! Up! Hey! Up!
I think that the government that recognized who he was and had him buried in Arlington National Cemetery was, in a small token, trying to repay the indignities I think that the previous government gave him. I think that there was a recognition that Joe Louis was more than just a boxer. He was a hero that came along at a time when America needed a hero.
They still ring the bell for Joe Louis at Ponton Lakes in New Jersey. Although Joe's lucky training ground burned down in 1980, the bell was saved. It's in a social club, and patrons pay $1 to Joe's favorite charity to ring it and remember a hero.
Dies ist der Brief von Herrn Schmeling und dies ist der Scheck von Herrn Schmeling.
Max Schmeling is every bit as much of a hero in Germany as Joe Louis is to Americans, and not simply because he continued to give money to good causes.
A great German, one of a kind. And I had the pleasure to benefit from that one of a kind. And I'm very pleased to say that they are good Germans. And Schmeling is their leader.
Max Schmeling and Joe Louis were remarkably similar men, ruthless in the ring, but fighters who transcended boxing. Perhaps that's why they became such close friends.
They both fought each other hard, and they believed that they should be victorious in the ring. I think the difference between boxing in these days and those days is that once they were out of the ring, those people respected each other in a way that allowed them to be friends with each other.